Can you believe that an entire world, a civilization stretching back centuries, could exist pressed flat against the mud, entirely dependent on the whims of a cold, unforgiving sky? This wasn't the romantic tapestry history paints. This was a grinding, agonizing existence, where every breath was a silent prayer against oblivion, a battle fought with bare hands against the merciless indifference of the natural world. They lived in the shadow of the year 1200, a time so dark, so completely devoid of modern assurance that we might as well be talking about another planet. Imagine a world where the only light came from sputtering tallow, and the roof over your head was literally just bundled straw, a vulnerable thatch that could, and often did, betray you in the dead of the winter rain, turning your earthen floor into a sucking pit of freezing mire. This is the story of Oakhaven, a village you will never find on any map, a tiny, forgotten scar on the vast green skin of medieval England. They were the invisible people, the ones whose names were only whispered in the cold parish records, destined only to plant, to harvest, and to die in the same unforgiving soil where they were born. Their lives defined by the brutal cycle of the seasons and the heavy hand of the lord of the manor. But Oakhaven was sitting on a secret, a profound, terrifying truth that was about to shatter the fragile peace of the priest, the tyrant, and every single soul scraping life from the earth. A catastrophe no one saw coming was already stirring beneath their very heels, a slow, insidious horror waiting for the perfect moment to erupt and consume everything they knew in a tidal wave of medieval dread. The tension in the air was palpable, thick as the morning fog that rolled in from the nearby fens, swallowing the thatch roofs whole until they looked like desperate islands floating in a cold gray sea. The air itself smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, and the ever-present, cloying scent of unwashed bodies and desperation. Every man, woman, and child was a clock ticking down to the next harvest, obsessed with the single, crushing thought: will the grain hold? Will the Lord take too much? Will we survive the deep frost? Survival wasn't a given, it was a miraculous annual evasion of death, a feat of sheer, grinding endurance that demanded every ounce of their meager strength. And yet, this year, the anxiety was different. It wasn't just the weather, which had been unseasonably cruel, delivering hailstones the size of pigeons' eggs in May. It was the feeling. Old Thomas, the village swineherd, a gnarled man who had seen 80 harvests come and go, swore the earth was breathing strangely, shuddering beneath his cracked leather boots. He claimed the pigs refused to root in the South Common field, squealing and shivering away from something unseen, something ancient and malevolent, stirring just inches below the surface of the plowed land, refusing the rich promise of acorns and grubs. Thomas said it smelled like old iron and betrayal, a scent that caught in the back of your throat like poison, an omen of unbelievable destruction. This fear wasn't superstition born of ignorance, It was the raw, instinctual alarm of people utterly connected to the earth, people whose lives were literally built upon it. They knew the language of the soil better than they knew Latin, and the soil was screaming. But the true catalyst for Oakhaven's doom didn't arrive on a storm cloud or emerged from the deep woods. It arrived on a high-stepping, mud-splattered warhorse, cloaked in expensive, dark wool, accompanied by 4 silent, terrifying men-at-arms who looked less like guards and more like instruments of torture. This was Master Geoffrey of Ashworth, the newly appointed steward for Baron Montague, a man whose reputation preceded him like the foul stench of a charnel house. He was not just here to collect taxes. He was here to squeeze a life out of Oakhaven until the pips squeaked, to extract every possible grain and shilling that his absent, greedy baron demanded. The previous steward, a soft, drunken man named Ulrich, had been lenient, turning a blind eye to a few stolen sheaves or an extra day granted for labor service. But Master Geoffrey was precision-engineered cruelty, a bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in steel and leather, and he carried a meticulously rolled parchment that was about to unleash hell upon these simple villagers. This parchment, signed and sealed with the Baron's heavy crest, wasn't just a tax demand. It was a declaration of war against the very concept of sustenance. It stated that, due to unforeseen expenditures concerning the Baron's new stone fortifications, the required wheat tithe was immediately doubled, effective immediately. Doubled. In a good year, this demand would have meant hunger. In this struggling, cold year, with the strange tremors and the reluctant pigs, doubling the tithe meant absolute, undeniable starvation for every family in the village before the first snows fell. The collective gasp that swept through the gathered villagers wasn't just shock. It was the sound of hope fracturing, of the thin thread of survival snapping completely. Their desperate eyes fixed on the man who stood tallest among them, the only one who dared to speak the language of resistance, even though the words tasted like ash. John the Miller, a large, powerful man whose arms were thick from a lifetime turning the water wheel, stepped forward, his face white with controlled fury, knowing that this single act of defiance might cost him his life, and yet knowing that silence would cost the lives of his children. Master Geoffrey, John's voice scraped, echoing off the timber frames of the small church. This cannot be done. If we give this much, we die. And that was the moment the catastrophe truly began, not with thunder, but with the cold, precise response of the steward, a response that revealed the true, deadly scope of the Baron's plan. Geoffrey smiled, a tight, unpleasant gesture that didn't reach his eyes. Then you will find a way, Miller. Or perhaps, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that still carried over the silent crowd. Perhaps you will simply find less mouths to feed. That chilling threat, the sudden, terrifying implication that the Lord was not just willing, but actively planning for mass death, was the earthquake that finally shattered the world of thatch roofs and earthen floors. The horror had arrived, and it wore the face of civilization itself. This was not a story of valiant knights and chivalry. This was the raw, brutal reality of survival against a system designed to crush them. And Oakhaven was about to learn that sometimes the only way to fight tyranny is to uncover the dark secrets it desperately tries to keep buried. The mud of Oakhaven clung to everything, not just the tattered hose and patched tunics of the peasants, but to their very souls. It was a physical manifestation of the crushing weight of Baron Alaric's tyranny, a lord whose cruelty was not measured in coin, but in the relentless theft of time and breath itself. They had just endured the harrowing boon work, the forced, unpaid labor demanded during the critical harvest season, where every muscle screamed for respite, and every hour stolen meant less food secured for their own families. This was life under the Norman yoke, a zero-sum game where the Lord always won, and death was merely the final, inevitable tax on existence. Yet, even the seasoned despair of Oakhaven could not prepare them for the Baron's latest decree, announced not by a simple bailiff, but by the dreaded Reeve, a peasant trader elevated to minor power, whose loyalty was bought with slightly less starvation. The message ripped through the chilled autumn air like a scythe. The Baron's personal granary, the massive, stone-reinforced structure that held every single kernel of their future, was deemed inadequate. Inadequate despite the back-breaking toil that had swelled the bins to bursting. This was not a plea. It was a command for extra labor, a new form of servitude that threatened to consume the final sliver of their precarious autumn existence. They were ordered to dig, not to dig drainage ditches or to clear new fields, but to excavate a massive, inexplicable trench around the perimeter of the manor grounds, a construction project that made no sense to agricultural minds. What horror was Baron Alaric attempting to conceal? The trench was deep, disturbingly so, delving past the damp, fertile topsoil into the unforgiving, hard clay beneath, demanding days of exhausting work from sunup until the dangerous, cold blackness of night. Young Thomas, barely 18, but hardened by years of field work, felt the familiar burning rage coalesce in his chest. His father had died last winter, weakened by the very same kind of extra demand, leaving Thomas responsible for his widowed mother and 2 younger sisters. He looked at the other villagers, faces etched with exhaustion, eyes hollowed out by fear. They were silent, resigned, knowing that refusal meant a visit from the Baron's armed men whose iron-shod boots made the earthen floor tremble in ways the strongest thunderstorm never could. The trench digging was an exercise in pure domination, serving no practical purpose they could discern, until old Master Eadwig, the village carpenter, whispered a terrifying theory. He claimed the Baron wasn't protecting his manor. He was sealing something in. Eadwig spoke of the forbidden woods bordering the north edge of the estate, a forest deemed royal land decades ago, which the Baron had controversially claimed ownership over through obscure legal maneuvering. Access to these woods was deathly forbidden, not just for hunting, which was already a capital crime under the hated forest laws, but even for gathering simple firewood or foraging. Now, as the trench approached the dense, dark line of trees, the true purpose became chillingly clear. The Baron was establishing an impenetrable boundary, isolating that forbidden patch of land completely. But why? The common belief was that the woods held nothing but scraggly trees and cold shadow. But Thomas, while digging near the boundary line, saw it, a fleeting glimpse of something shiny, metallic, buried just beneath a root system the size of a grown man. It was not gold nor silver. It was a section of finely crafted iron grating, expertly concealed beneath a thin layer of turf, almost like a massive, hidden vent or access point leading deeper underground. Thomas quickly covered it, his heart hammering against his ribs like a panicked, trapped bird. He knew instantly this was the secret, the thing the Baron was willing to starve them to hide. The feudal contract, the very foundation of their existence, was built on the lie that the Lord provided protection in exchange for loyalty and labor. But what if the Lord was extracting more than just grain and sweat? What if he was extracting their future? The irony was bitter. In 1200 CE, the average peasant family required an impossible 1,500 square feet of land just to survive the year, and they were lucky to get half that, while the Lord controlled thousands of acres. Now they were digging their own graves to protect his hidden resource. The tension was so thick, it felt like the air itself was turning to ice. The next day, 2 men, Abelard and Godwin, did not report for the corvée. Their families claimed they had gone to fetch water from the distant river, but the river was frozen, and their footprints led straight toward the forbidden woods, right where Thomas had seen the iron grating. Fear became hysteria. The Reeve, sensing the instability, beat Godwin's elderly mother publicly, demanding to know where the men had fled. She swore on the Holy Rood that they had simply vanished, swallowed by the cold earth. But Oakhaven knew the truth. They hadn't fled the village. They had stumbled upon the secret, and the Baron had silenced them permanently. Thomas waited until the moon was just a sliver of broken bone in the sky, reflecting dimly off the frozen mud paths. He gathered his courage, the weight of his family's survival heavy on his shoulders, and armed himself with the only weapon a peasant possessed, a sharpened spade. He had to know what the grating concealed. Was it a secret mine, a hidden treasury, or something far more sinister? something related to the persistent, low fever that had been plaguing the village children all summer, a sickness the Baron dismissed as common swamp air. He crept toward the newly dug trench, the smell of damp clay and fear heavy in his nostrils, praying the Baron's guards were asleep. The trench was a gaping maw in the landscape, a perfect barrier designed to keep intruders out, or keep something in. He slid down the steep, slippery wall, the cold gripping his clothes, moving toward the spot he had marked earlier. The grating was still there, but now a faint metallic scent, unlike any earth smell he knew, wafted up from the cracks. He pushed the spade against the turf covering it, and the earth gave way easily. Below the grating, a narrow carved stone staircase spiraled downward into absolute darkness, and from the black pit rose a sound that chilled Thomas to the marrow, a low, rhythmic, mechanical thump, 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 like the steady, unforgiving heartbeat of tyranny itself. He was staring directly into the engine room of the Baron's secret power, the hidden horror that sustained their oppressor, and the thought of Abelard and Godwin lost in that terrifying darkness made his blood run cold. He knew, with sudden, paralyzing certainty, that escaping the mud and misery of 1200 CE Oakhaven wasn't about surviving the winter. It was about surviving the Baron's terrible, subterranean truth. The air in the hovel, thick with the smell of stale smoke and unwashed fear, suddenly felt thinner than the winter ice. Thomas didn't just understand the secret, he felt it crawling under his own skin, a cold, earth-bound dread that superseded even the gnawing hunger that had become his constant shadow. The Baron's truth wasn't written in the church's ledger or declared from the pulpit. It was buried beneath the very fields they were forced to plow, a parasitic drain on the lifeblood of Oakhaven itself. For generations, the villagers lived by the unspoken, unyielding law of the 3 days. 3 days to work their own meager strips of land, the precious half-acre known as the Virgate, which was supposed to sustain them through the crushing, unforgiving English winter. And 3 days dedicated entirely to the Baron's private domain, his profitable, essential fields. But that balanced, precarious survival had shattered like thin ice under a heavy boot. Lately, the demand was 5 days, sometimes 6. The summons was always delivered at dawn by the Baron's reeve, Edmund, a man whose smile held the chill of a winter vault, demanding more hands for the new works. The demands weren't for standard agricultural labor. They were for something that devoured sunlight and muscle, but produced nothing edible. The result was catastrophic. Their own Virgates, the difference between surviving March and becoming part of the graveyard mud, were starved of their hands. They were starving themselves to fatten a secret. Thomas remembered the strange carts, heavily shrouded and drawn by exhausted oxen, moving only at the dead of night, toward the distant, ill-omened woodland known as the Black Hollow. The new works, a massive, unholy excavation site that consumed men and returned only silence. The official story, whispered by the priests, whose loyalty was bought with the Baron's tainted gold and enforced by the Reeve's iron-tipped staff, was that the Baron was searching for Heaven's Iron, a mythical ore, they claimed, that would bring divine wealth and protection to the entire fiefdom. But Thomas had heard the terrified whispers from the few men who returned. They weren't digging up metal. They were fighting wet, collapsing earth and hauling up mud, sickness, and history. Every bucket of cold, wet earth hauled up represented another week of starvation for the family of the man hauling it. The human toll was merciless. Poor old Will, Thomas's neighbor, a man who could usually lift a full sack of grain without a grunt, had come back from the shaft barely able to stand. He coughed up black silt, his eyes burning with an unnatural fever, dying within 3 agonizing days, his body immediately claimed by the relentless mud. The Baron wasn't just stealing their labor, the agonizing corvée service that broke their backs. He was holding them financially hostage to their very birthright. Even if a man somehow managed to evade the mandated labor, the crushing feudal taxes would drag him back down into servitude. The arbitrary tallage, a tax imposed whenever the Baron felt the need for extra coin to fund his subterranean folly, was due next month. The peasants had no appeal, no recourse, only the knowledge that failure to pay meant immediate forfeiture, usually resulting in the loss of their oxen, the very engine of their fragile existence. And the price of simply trying to maintain a semblance of normal life was brutal. If Thomas's daughter wanted to marry a man from the neighboring village of Throckmorton, the Baron demanded the Mershit fee, a humiliating, exorbitant payment for the loss of a female worker from his estate. This wasn't protection, it was ownership. And God forbid Thomas himself should perish. The dreaded Harriet would immediately claim the best animal or best piece of property he owned, leaving his wife and children destitute, unprotected, and wholly reliant on the Baron's fleeting mercy. It was a perfectly designed cage, built not of stone and mortar, but of parchment, absolute power, and the inescapable law of the manor. The Baron's obsession with this subterranean folly meant the entire economic and social structure of Oakhaven was buckling under the weight. The collective survival of the village was being sacrificed for a hole in the ground that promised nothing but death. The greatest immediate danger wasn't just chronic hunger, but the structural degradation caused by the lack of resources. They needed wood for construction and fuel, but the Baron had severely restricted access to the communal woodlands, fearing the peasants would steal the timber desperately needed for the shaft's deep shoring. The resulting desperation meant families were forced to strip bark and scrape moss just to keep a small, miserable fire alive for cooking and warmth. The thatch roofs, which required constant maintenance and fresh straw, were rotting, inviting vermin and, terrifyingly, fire. A single misplaced ember in this tightly packed cluster of hovels could erase the entire village in an hour, a sudden, horrifying end to a lifetime of toil. Fear of the dreaded fire was a constant companion, second only to the fear of the Baron's mounted guards, who patrolled the perimeter of the manor with chilling, unnecessary regularity. Thomas watched his youngest son shivering beside the meager fire pit. The boy's face was unnaturally pale, his stomach slightly distended, the cruel, telltale sign of chronic nutrient deficiency, a sickness the locals simply called the empty gut. Thomas knew he could wait no longer. He had to act, and action meant understanding the source of the rot. He had to understand what was truly at the bottom of that shaft. His mind violently pulled back the memory of the cryptic, feverish words mumbled by the dying will before his lungs surrendered to the black silt. The cold stone, it breathes. The intense secrecy, the shockingly high death rate, the absurd economic cost, it all pointed toward a terrifying conclusion, far beyond simple, if wasteful, mining folly. The Baron was using the coerced, brutalized labor of Oakhaven to unearth something ancient, something best left buried deep within the cold, silent earth. Thomas realized his only chance lay not in confronting the Baron directly, which was guaranteed suicide, but in understanding the specific layout of the new works, finding the unguarded entry point, and witnessing the subterranean terror firsthand. It was time to descend into the Baron's personal hell, armed only with a desperate will to save his family and a dull, well-worn iron spade. The night was cold, but the earth below promised a far colder, infinitely darker, and lethal truth. The iron spade, dull and scarred by 1,000 seasons of grueling labor, bit into the frozen crust of the March earth. Every clang resonated in the terrifying stillness of the night, a sound that Elric feared would travel across the open communal field and straight into the ear of the bailiff, Master Thorn. That sound, the relentless shink thud of steel meeting clay, was the rhythm of his desperation, the counterpoint to the desperate whimpers of his youngest son, shivering back in the hovel, struck down by the sudden, brutal sickness that had swept through the hamlet of Oakhaven. This wasn't just soil he was turning. This was the grave he was digging for his own hope, or perhaps the truth that might save them all from the invisible horror tightening its grip. He tasted mud and fear, the bitter flavor of a life lived perpetually on the edge of the abyss, bound to the tyranny of the ground he labored upon. He dug with the frantic energy of a trapped animal, ignoring the way the cold seeped into his ragged tunic and gnawed at the exposed skin of his forearms, forcing his mind away from the agonizing realization that if he were caught here, on the Lord's land, digging without permission, the punishment would be swift, public, and terminal. The bailiff enforced the law of the manor with whips and iron, And Elric knew that seeking secrets was a far greater sin than stealing grain. The secret was the Lord's ultimate weapon, and to uncover it was to challenge the divine right of oppression itself. 3 feet down, where the earth should have softened into rich, plowable loam, the very lifeblood of their meager survival, designated for the mandated crops of the year, the spade struck something solid, dense, and utterly unnatural. It wasn't the expected granite of the subterranean shelf, nor the thick, grasping ancient root of a boundary oak, marking the edge of a peasant strip. It was a chilling, hollow thunk, the sound of wood against metal, a sound that froze the blood in his veins, instantly silencing the crickets and the frantic internal hammering of his own heart. He dropped the spade, the handle slipping from his numb fingers, falling to his knees in the cold, wet trench, scrambling with his bare, cracked hands. The dirt gave way to reveal not just rotten wood, but meticulously crafted, worked timber, a hidden structure buried beneath the very fields they were mandated to farm for the lord of the manor, Sir Callan, generations ago. This was an insult to the earth, a defiance of the natural order and the strip system that defined their existence, a secret too enormous for their miserable patch of land to contain. Who, in this starving, miserable corner of the realm, possessed the resources or the sheer audacity to bury a substantial timber structure beneath the common land that was watched perpetually? Every stick of wood, every hour of labor, every single nail belonged to the Lord. Building anything, even a simple shed, without his explicit, terrifying permission, was not just theft of materials, it was an act of treason against the feudal order, a capital offense, punishable by immediate, agonizing death upon the gallows hill. Elric clawed away the remaining soil, his breathing ragged, the adrenaline burning away the paralyzing cold. He found a rough, heavy lid, sealed with ancient tar-like pitch, and secured with thick, rusted iron clasps. Clasps too fine, too sturdy, too well forged for any peasant possession or humble storage box. This was not a misplaced chest of tools abandoned by a fleeing serf. This was a vault, and it had been intentionally hidden long ago, judging by the layer of undisturbed ancient clay pressing down upon it, suggesting the secret preceded even the current generation of Oakhaven dwellers. The lethal truth promised by the old whispers and the sudden, inexplicable plague now seemed to be emanating directly from the ground beneath his feet, a silent, earthen prison built to keep something horrific confined and forgotten by the toiling masses above. With a desperate grunt, Elric leveraged the heavy spade against the iron latch, praying the grating sound wouldn't carry on the damped night air. The hinge shrieked, a sound like tortured metal, a sound that felt like a scream ripped from his own throat, instantly regretted and swallowed by the night. He held his breath, listening for the distant baying of the Lord's hounds, for the ominous crunch of the bailiff's heavy boots on the frozen path. But only the sighing wind and the relentless internal thud of his own pulse answered his terror. He used every ounce of his peasant strength, the strength forged by 50 years of perpetual hunger and back-breaking toil, to heave the heavy lid upward, tearing the ancient pitch seal. The lid groaned, resisting the light. The smell hit him first, a terrifying, overwhelming stench that was not the expected odor of decay or simple rot, but something far more chemical, sharper, acrid, and deeply metallic. A dry, sterile scent that scraped at the back of his throat and made his eyes water violently. The flickering tallow lantern he had brought cast a trembling, weak light into the darkness below, illuminating the contents of the vault. It wasn't treasure, though gold would have been simpler. It wasn't bones, though he might have preferred the clean simplicity of a corpse and a definite ending. What lay revealed was a chilling, meticulously organized cache of sealed earthenware jars, stacked high and wide, far more numerous than any single family, even the lord's, would require for mere survival. Each jar was painstakingly labeled with symbols Elric did not recognize, cryptic markings unlike the Latin script used by the priest, or the crude tally marks of the bailiff's accounting ledger. But beneath the jars, stacked like dry, brittle firewood, were hundreds of small, dried husks of grain, oats and rye, the very crops they were forced to grow every season. But these were unnaturally bleached, stripped of their vital nutrients, ground into a fine, sterile, almost purely white powder. This was not storage for winter. This was the dark heart of the conspiracy. He realized with a terrifying clarity that they weren't starving due to poor yields or divine displeasure or bad weather, but because the Lord or someone connected to him was systematically intercepting the true, robust yield of the manor, replacing the vital, nutrient-rich communal grain with this useless white dust. A planned, slow-motion starvation designed to control the masses. The sickness that plagued his son, the lethargy that had stolen the physical strength from the entire village, the sudden, unexplained infant deaths reported so frequently this cold winter, it wasn't a curse of God or a failure of the land to produce. It was poison, slow and deliberate, delivered through the very bread they ate at the Lord's allowance. He stared into the vault, his simple peasant mind reeling from the sheer, icy malice of the plot. The Lord was not simply collecting rent. He was manufacturing weakness, ensuring the serfs were just strong enough to work the fields until they dropped, but too weak to ever organize, too depleted to fight back against the relentless, crushing grip of feudal power that chained them to the soil. This pit was not just a storehouse. It was a proof of systematic murder, a silent testimony to the calculated slaughter of his people through engineered famine. He reached into the vault, his hand closing around one of the heavy, sealed jars. The cold, smooth clay damning evidence against his palm. He had sought a truth, and he had found a terror that transcended mere sickness. He had found the ultimate weapon used against them. And now, holding this lethal evidence, he knew that the moment he stepped out of this trench, his life and the fate of Oakhaven was sealed, either by the bailiff's swift rope or by the vengeance he now had the terrifying power to unleash upon the manor. The spade lay forgotten in the mud, irrelevant. All that mattered was the weight of the jar, the silent, terrible promise of vengeance it contained, and the agonizing knowledge that morning was only 3 hours away, bringing with it the dawn patrol and the end of all secrets, including his own. The air in the hovel was thick, not just with the smoke of the struggling central fire, but with the scent of raw, absolute panic. Every breath Aethelred took was a physical calculation of remaining seconds. 3 hours of darkness stretching before him like an impossible, treacherous marsh. He could hear the low, wet cough of his wife, Ilara, trying to stifle the sound, knowing that even a whisper of illness could draw unwanted attention from the harsh, cold night outside, where only the wolves and the Lord's men truly reigned. The unforgiving truth of the year 1200 CE was that freedom was a concept reserved for the dead or the distant nobility. For the tenant farmer, the world was a 6-acre prison fenced by custom and enforced by the iron will of the baron, a man whose mercy was as thin and sharp as a newly forged blade of iron. This existence wasn't fragile, it was already broken, held together only by the constant, agonizing fear of escalating punishment. The small, bundled sack hidden beneath the straw of his meager bed was the key to his doom, the physical embodiment of his defiance. It wasn't gold, not silver, but a handful of perfectly ripe, illegally gathered blackberries and a few strips of cured venison, meat taken not from the Lord's legal cull, but from the deep, protected shadow of the Baron's private forest, the Chase. Poaching was not merely theft, it was sedition, a direct challenge to the very foundation of the feudal hierarchy, punishable by the mutilation of hands, or more often, the public gruesome spectacle of hanging, swinging slowly over the common field as a chilling warning. He had risked everything for a mouthful of protein and a sweetness his starving children had never tasted. A momentary break from the endless, soul-crushing monotony of thin oat gruel and hard bread. The stable diet that kept them just alive enough to toil. That single transgression, that act of desperate, foolish love, now stood between his family and utter destruction, a dark shadow lengthening as the unseen sun prepared its ascent. The patrol wasn't just men, it was the mechanism of a brutal, inescapable law system, where suspicion was proof, and the accused had zero rights under the arbitrary power of the Baron's delegated authority. They were led by Osric the Reeve, a man whose face was said to be carved from the very stone of the Baron's keep, devoid of human warmth or pity, and armed with the full, terrifying authority of the court leet, the manorial court that dispensed instant, irreversible judgment. Osric knew the rhythm of starvation, the telltale signs of desperation, and the smell of illicit venison clinging to the thin, woven tunics of the poor. When Osric arrived at dawn, he wouldn't knock. He would kick in the door, scattering the cold embers and the fragile pretense of a peaceful life, bringing the freezing morning air and the cold steel of his judgment into the heart of their home. He would search every corner, overturn the single stool, and question the children until their terrified sobs cried out the truth they didn't even know they possessed. For medieval law allowed for the testimony of minors if they were deemed to understand the gravity of sin. The silence outside was broken only by the drip of rainwater from the deteriorating thatch roof, a sound that felt like the slow, rhythmic ticking of a massive, unseen clock counting down to his end. Thatch, the ultimate symbol of their poverty, was their only shelter. Yet it was also dry tinder waiting for a vengeful spark, a perfect fuel for the fires of communal punishment, should Ethelred's crime necessitate a terrifying example be made of the entire community.
The floor beneath his feet was packed earth, cold, damp, and smelling perpetually of rot and old urine. The entire structure was not a home, but a temporary coffin built of wattle and mud, destined to be reclaimed by the very soil they slavishly worked in the Lord's fields until their dying day. There was nowhere to run. The boundaries of the village were marked by the common field, and beyond that, the terrifying unknown of the King's Highway, patrolled by the sheriff's men, equally brutal, equally hungry for tax and penalty, making escape a fantasy more dangerous than facing the reeve. Ethelred's mind was a frantic, churning mill wheel, grinding through impossible options. Should he throw the venison into the communal muck heap? No, the dogs would find it, and the reeve knew the habits of every scavenger in the village, reading their frantic rooting as easily as a priest reads scripture. Should he bury it beneath the fire pit? The earth was too wet, too soft. Osric knew the look of freshly disturbed soil, like a vulture recognizes dying prey, detecting the slightest indentation or change in color.
His gaze fell upon the rough-hewn beam supporting the central roof, a massive, ancient piece of oak, riddled with deep, dark fissures caused by centuries of settlement, moisture, and neglect. A tiny, impossible hope flared in the darkness. Maybe, just maybe, he could wedge the parcel so deep into one of those cracks that only years of slow decay would reveal its existence, hiding it in the very architecture of his misery. He moved with the agonizing slowness of a wounded animal, every creak of the floorboards screaming his location to the non-existent observers, magnifying his movements 10 times over in the suffocating quiet. He reached up, the weight of the beam pressing down on him, a metaphor for the weight of the Baron's entire jurisdiction, a crushing oppression that demanded constant, invisible tribute. The venison, wrapped tightly in a piece of oiled linen stolen years ago from the Baron's laundry, a crime in itself, was slick with the cold dampness. He had to make it fit without splintering the linen, without dropping it onto the telltale mud, and without making the tiniest sound that would wake Ilara, or worse, carry through the thin wattle and daub walls to the sleeping neighbors, who might be coerced into testimony by Osric's promises of temporary relief from their own crushing debt or a threat to their meager harvest share. This was a silent war fought in inches. It took 10 minutes of excruciating microscopic movement. His fingers were raw, scraped by the rough, splintered wood, but the sack finally disappeared into the shadow of the beam, swallowed by the wood and the grime of centuries, vanishing into the abyss. He backed away, wiping the cold sweat from his brow, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage of bone. But as he looked up, another fear, colder and more visceral than the law, began to bloom in the suffocating darkness. He had disturbed something else in the dark recesses of the timber, a low, scratching, persistent sound, the unmistakable rhythm of tiny claws on rough wood, a sound that only fresh, unguarded meat could possibly attract. Rats. The village was plagued by them, vectors of disease and destruction, but this scratching was immediately above where the meat now lay hidden, an immediate, moving threat. If the rats, driven mad by the sudden scent of cured venison, chewed through the oiled linen and scattered the evidence, Osric wouldn't even need to search. The small, gnawed remnants falling onto the earthen floor would be enough proof for instant execution. Worse, the constant gnawing might cause the beam to loosen, a structural failure that would bring the entire fragile home down on their heads, a silent, chaotic burial beneath the thatch and mud, ending their suffering instantly, but condemning his soul. The 3 hours until dawn had just become an eternity, defined by the scraping of minute, unstoppable teeth, a new clock ticking inside the walls of his terror. He had traded the immediate threat of the Baron's noose for a slow, internal demolition, a war fought against the darkness itself, where the true enemy was hunger, both his family's and the vermin's, an undeniable savage force in the brutal architecture of 1200 CE England. The light, the promised light of the morning, felt less like salvation and more like the spotlight for his final agonizing performance before the brutal law. The sun, that merciless celestial eye, finally breached the horizon, painting the thick, damp air not with warmth, but with the cold, sickly yellow of impending catastrophe. Thomas felt the rough hemp rope biting into the skin of his wrists, a constant, abrasive reminder that he was no longer a man, but property awaiting disposition, a piece of failing livestock in the Lord's great inventory. The earthen floor of the small, hastily repurposed storage shed, a place usually reserved for spoiled grain, offered no comfort, only the smell of fermentation and decay, mirroring the state of his own rapidly decaying hope. The stillness of the early morning was a profound, echoing silence that preceded the inevitable roar of the storm, the public spectacle of punishment. Every nerve-ending screamed, anticipating the sound of heavy boots crunching on the frost-hardened track leading up to the manor's secondary holding house, the temporary prison. He knew the watching villagers, his neighbors, were praying less for his life and more that the Lord's wrath would be contained to him alone, a desperate hope forged in the fires of collective terror. And then the silence broke. It wasn't the sound of heavy boots, but the chilling, rhythmic clack, clack of a riding stick tapping against the wooden frame of a cart, a sound more terrifying than any battle cry. Master Elric, the Lord's bailiff, had arrived, the physical embodiment of the feudal contract, flanked by two hulking, silent men whose job was not to question law, but merely to enforce its finality. Elric was the true, immediate sovereign here, holding the power of life and death, backed by the remote, invisible authority of the Baron de Montfort, who had never even set foot on this wretched, muddy land. His appearance was the very definition of menacing authority. Impeccably clean leather boots, contrasting cruelly with the widespread squalor, a tightly woven woolen tunic, and a face permanently set in an expression of bored disgust, as if the very act of judging these muddy peasants was a stain upon his elevated existence. The crime, the horrible transgression that had brought Thomas to this point, was not simple theft, not murder, but a far deeper offense in the cold calculus of the manor economy. The unauthorized slaughter of a single, scrawny deer. A desperate, futile attempt to feed a starving wife and child during the harsh late winter. This wasn't justice as they knew it in the burgeoning towns bound by royal decree. This was the custom of the manor, a terrifyingly flexible set of rules that meant whatever Elric decided it meant in that precise, unforgiving moment, a doctrine of arbitrary power. The forest was the Lord's treasure house, and to poach from it was not just a crime against property, but a direct assault on the Lord's ability to maintain his status, his fealty to the crown, and his capacity to field soldiers. Thomas knew the mandated penalty for venison theft was often the loss of a hand, a brutal, visible example meant to send a shudder of absolute, paralyzing compliance through the entire village population. But Elric was known for his theatrical cruelty. Rumor whispered he preferred the chilling spectacle of abjuration, the forced, permanent exile from the only piece of ground a man had ever known, guaranteeing a miserable, wandering death outside the protection of the king's law, a death by exposure and starvation. This form of judicial terror was entirely strategic. It ensured that the Lord's lands were worked constantly, that the corvée labor was always performed without complaint, and that no serf dared to think they owned anything, not even the meager breath drawn into their lungs. The villagers, shivering masses gathered just beyond the manor boundary line, watched in horrified silence, knowing that Thomas's fate was a mirror reflecting their own inherent, absolute disposability under the weight of the feudal system. If Thomas was destroyed, the Lord claimed his wife and children as further chattel, absorbing them into the lowest tier of servitude, deepening their already crushing, inescapable debt to the soil and the Lord's ledger. Elric strode into the shed, the stench of the spoiled grain momentarily masking the raw fear radiating from Thomas. "Stand, wretch," the bailiff commanded, his voice sharp and utterly devoid of mercy, carrying the structural weight of the entire Norman administrative machine. Thomas, weakened by days without food and the crushing psychological pressure of impending doom, struggled to his feet, his shadow long and distorted in the weak morning light. Elric did not ask for a confession. He demanded an acknowledgement of absolute guilt, already inscribed in the punitive ledger before he even arrived, a signature on his own death warrant. "You stole the king's peace and the lord's property," Elric spat, lifting his polished staff, tapping it rhythmically against the dirt floor, the sound a metronome counting down Thomas's remaining moments. "The hand, perhaps, or the tongue, so you can no longer spread your filthy lies among the peasantry?" Thomas swallowed hard, the taste of fear metallic on his tongue. This was the precise moment to reveal his desperate countermove, the final, terrifying gambit he had prepared in the darkest hours of the night. He had not just slaughtered a deer, he had inadvertently uncovered something far more valuable and far more dangerous, something hidden beneath the ancient, crumbling stones of the old Roman road they were forced to repair last spring. A small lead box, heavy with the forbidden shimmer of ancient coins, or perhaps something far older and darker than mere coin. Thomas forced the words out, his voice hoarse but steady, amplified by the sheer terror that fueled him. "Master Elric, spare the hand. The deer was desperation, yes, but I can offer payment that surpasses 10 years of tithe, a treasure worthy of the Lord himself, though I offer it to you." Elric's cold, bored expression fractured, replaced by a flicker of intense, dangerous curiosity. Gold, the one thing that superseded the rigid hierarchy of medieval land management and law enforcement. "Speak quickly, serf. I grow tired of your peasant theatrics. If this is a trick, your death will be slow and instructional." Thomas described the strange, heavy box, hidden beneath the layer of thick mud and moss, carefully avoiding any mention of the eerie, cold sensation it gave off, or the strange, unsettling, non-Christian symbols etched deep upon the lead. He focused only on the metal's worth, the sheer, unimaginable value to a man like Elric, perpetually seeking to line his own pockets and elevate his position beyond this miserable, forgotten manor. The bailiff leaned in, his clean leathers squeaking, the scent of expensive spices momentarily overwhelming the musty air of the shed. This was the true nature of power in 1200 CE, not piety, not honor, but raw, brutal avarice, the core engine of the system. Elric was willing to overlook the breaking of the sacred forest laws if the price was right, if the reward could elevate him above his current station as mere manager of dirt and misery, and lift him into the ranks of true wealth. "Where is this compensation, Thomas?" Elric whispered, the volume dropping dramatically, signaling a shift from public judgment to private, deadly negotiation. The terror was still present, but it had shape-shifted. Thomas was no longer facing a simple execution. He was now locked in a high-stakes, intimate deal with a predator whose loyalty extended only to the weight of the precious metal. His life was now the key to Elric's sudden, illicit, and absolutely secret wealth. It is buried where the old road crosses the widow's stream, master. Deep beneath the stones that the cartwheels always scrape. Thomas confirmed, his eyes fixed desperately on Elric's reaction, searching for any hint of treachery, knowing deep down that betrayal was inevitable once the prize was secured. Elric finally smiled, a thin, chilling expression that promised nothing good but offered temporary reprieve. Excellent. The hand stays, for now, but you will guide me there, alone, immediately. He turned to his two silent enforcers, signaling them to stay back, to maintain the appearance of the morning's expected punitive display, protecting the secret negotiation with a powerful, misleading facade of routine brutality. The immediate problem of the law had been temporarily suspended, replaced by the far more acute, individualized horror of becoming an indispensable tool to a powerful, greedy man. A man who would certainly dispose of the tool once its purpose was served. The sun was now fully up, blindingly bright, illuminating the path forward. A treacherous trail where Thomas was leading his executioner not to the gallows, but to a horde that might seal both their fates with ancient, slumbering curses. The very act of digging up the treasure, of revealing what had been hidden for centuries beneath the Roman stones, felt like the final, irrevocable breaking of a long-standing oath to the earth. The soil itself seemed to groan under the weight of this impending violation, and Thomas realized with a sickening certainty that chilled him deeper than the morning frost, that the true danger was not the Lord's feudal law, but whatever ancient, unholy power slept within that leaden box, now destined to be awakened by the unstoppable force of human greed. The iron pickaxe of Master Thomas, foreman to Lord Ashworth's cursed enterprise, swung down with a sickening finality, shattering the fragile lead seal that had protected the coffer for 1,000 years. A sound like muffled thunder echoed in the deep, damp trench, a sound that every peasant digging in that accursed field would forever recognize as the moment their world died. Not the loud clatter of metal, but the gasp of vacuum, sucking the clean, honest air of the English countryside into a pit of forgotten, primordial evil. What burst forth was not glittering gold, nor the polished jewels of a forgotten king, but a vapor, thick and viscous, smelling overwhelmingly of rust, stagnant swamp water, and the metallic tang of dried blood that stung the throat. It clung low to the earth, a creeping gray-green fog that refused to dissipate even under the weak, sickly light of the winter sun, seeming to draw the warmth out of everything it touched. Thomas, driven by a lifetime of ambition and the acute, crushing fear of his master's whip, leaned in too close, his eyes wide and hungry, fully expecting to see the glint of untold wealth that would change his miserable fate forever. He didn't scream when the vapor hit him. He merely choked, a dry, rattling cough erupting from his chest as the silent poison filled his lungs, burning them from the inside out. Then his eyes rolled back, showing only the terrible, glistening whites. and he began to claw desperately and violently at his own face, tearing strips of skin from his cheeks and forehead, as if attempting to rip off a mask that was not, could not be, truly there. He was consumed not by fire, but by instant, searing madness. The other field laborers, simple men, accustomed only to the predictable and manageable misery of the plow and the Lord's periodic starvation, scattered instantly, dropping their heavy tools into the mud that was now rapidly becoming their common grave. They had seen men die from falling rocks or the sudden, brutal bite of a mad dog, but this was the sudden, personalized, and terrifying vengeance of a forgotten God, manifesting as a pure, debilitating mental affliction. The horror was deceptively subtle at first. The fog didn't kill instantly, or even loudly. It was designed only to change things, to corrupt the soul before it withered the body. It seeped, slow and unavoidable, toward the nearby cluster of miserable wattle and daub huts that constituted the village of Oakhaven, traveling faster than any galloping horse, carried on the very breath of the fearful, desperate men who ran home for sanctuary. In 1200 CE, the terrifying concept of microbial contagion was an absolute mystery, often conflated entirely with divine displeasure, the presence of witchcraft, or the just punishment for secret sin. If a man coughed, the immediate assumption was spiritual corruption, not physical sickness. Now, as the thick, corrosive gray mist enveloped Oakhaven, the terrifying, unmistakable signs began appearing with cruel speed. First, the precious, indispensable livestock refused to eat, shivering violently and uncontrollably in their crude, flimsy pens, their normally intelligent eyes cloudy and distressed, weeping a thick white discharge. Then came the fever among the small children, the most vulnerable among the already vulnerable population. Little Elfric, barely 5 years old and already frail from the eternal hunger, woke up burning with an impossible internal heat. But instead of crying out for his mother's comfort, he began to speak in a language no living soul recognized, a harsh, guttural sound that seemed to scrape against the inside of the cottage walls, vibrating with an ancient power. The villagers, already living permanently on the razor's edge of starvation and total societal collapse, panicked instantly. They barred their thin doors, made of woven twigs and dried clay, but the leaden box's curse did not respect simple, pathetic barriers made of straw and mud. It was air, it was fear. It was the very soil turning sentient and malevolent against them, a total environmental betrayal. Lord Ashworth, miles away in the comforting solidity of his massive stone manor, received word of the unusual affliction with typical aristocratic, self-centered callousness, assuming it was merely the usual expected seasonal fever, exaggerated wildly by exaggerated peasant superstition and their inherent weakness. He sent 2 heavily armed guards and a single, immensely reluctant priest, Father Elias, demanding in no uncertain terms that the profit-driven digging continue regardless of any supposed plague. Father Elias, a man whose faith was certainly stronger than his stomach, arrived to find a scene of agonizing medieval chaos, far worse than any common outbreak of the sweating sickness or the bloody flux. The afflicted weren't just feverish or weak. They were tormented by shared waking visions, whispering constantly about the cold ones and the black mouth of the earth. He approached the cursed trench, his brass crucifix held high, the metallic chill of the brutal winter air doing little to calm the profound, unnatural heat emanating from the spot where the leaden box now lay open, inert, but still silently exhaling its residual poison. Inside the box, Father Elias did not find the expected riches or the venerated bones of a forgotten saint, but something far, far more unnerving and terrifying than both. The coffer held a single, perfectly smooth, utterly black obsidian slab, etched with glyphs that visibly predated the arrival of the conquering Romans, symbols that spoke of a time before Christ had even touched these cursed, isolated shores. These were not the common runes of Viking savagery, nor the Latin prayers of the conquerors. They were the terrifying sigils of the elder faith, the primal, chthonic energies that the Church had worked tirelessly for 800 painful years to completely bury and erase. And resting upon the ominous black stone, pulsing with a faint, almost internal light that seemed to draw the life out of the air, was a small, perfectly cylindrical vial, no bigger than a thumb, containing a thick, gelatinous dark liquid that appeared to absorb the surrounding light rather than reflect it. This was the true source of the vapor, the ancient payload of the coffer, deliberately and lovingly sealed away by some long-forgotten powerful order who understood its danger. Elias understood instantly, with a sinking horror in his soul, that this was not merely a matter for prayer, holy water, or simple exorcism. This was a confrontation with history itself, a war between the established light and the primordial darkness that dwelt beneath the very foundations of their meager, struggling civilization. He slammed the heavy lead lid shut with a desperate, heavy thud, sealing the remaining concentrated poison inside the thick casing, hoping against all reason to contain the inevitable. But the desperate act was tragically too late. He turned swiftly to leave, intending to ride hell for leather back to Ashworth Manor to warn the oblivious lord that the greedy pursuit of temporary earthly wealth had irrevocably unearthed eternal, widespread damnation. As he walked, the heavy mud beneath his simple leather boots seemed to shift and shudder with palpable malice, not just the usual winter muck, but something agitated, deeply restless, almost alive. He looked back one last time at the trench, just as a small, seemingly insignificant movement caught his eye. The water that had pooled in the deepest part of the muddy excavation was no longer merely reflecting the gray, indifferent sky. It was churning, slowly, deliberately, beginning to bubble with a sickly, shimmering, iridescent foam that tasted of iron and despair. And from the deepest, blackest pit of the cursed earth, a sound began to rise. Not the human cries of the sick and the dying, but a low, resonant, terrible groan. The unmistakable sound of the ancient, sleeping earth waking up to claim its dreadful due. The horror had been utterly released, and now it was gathering its unnatural, unstoppable strength.